The late evening rush at La Maison had finally died down. Steam rose from the kitchen vents into the chilly Manhattan air as the young waitress wiped down her last table, her tired feet aching in her sensible black shoes. She'd been on her feet for nearly 12 hours, serving countless plates of perfectly seared steaks and delicate French pastries to guests who barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge her. The dining room was almost empty now, with just a few lingering couples savoring their desserts. Soft light from the crystal chandeliers caught the polished surface of the grand piano that sat in the corner, a magnificent instrument that seemed to call to her every time she passed by. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she'd brush her fingers along its smooth wooden surface, remembering the old upright piano that still sat in her grandmother's farmhouse back in Michigan. Life had taken such unexpected turns since those childhood days. She could still picture herself as a little girl, perched on that worn piano bench, her grandmother standing behind her, gently correcting her posture. "Music isn't just in your fingers," her grandmother would say. "It's in your heart." Hours would slip by as she practiced, the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafting from the kitchen, while sunlight streamed through lace curtains her grandmother had made by hand. But dreams of becoming a concert pianist had faded when her family faced hard times. College plans were put on hold, and one temporary job led to another. Now here she was, 24 years old, working double shifts at one of New York's finest restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on her. Spending her evenings serving Manhattan's elite in a place that housed such a beautiful instrument, one that probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years. As she gathered empty wine glasses onto her tray, she noticed Mr. Thompson, the restaurant owner, talking to one of the regular performers who played during dinner service. Their voices carried across the quiet dining room. "Medical emergency. Can't make it tomorrow night. Private party." Her heart skipped a beat. Tomorrow was the annual charity gala, one of the restaurant's biggest events. Every year, it drew some of the city's most influential people: musicians, conductors, wealthy patrons of the arts. The piano was always the centerpiece of the evening. She glanced at the instrument again, its sleek black surface reflecting the dimmed lighting. 10 years had passed since she'd last performed for anyone except her grandmother's cat. Her fingers twitched slightly as she imagined how those polished keys would feel beneath them. She'd seen the sheet music the regular pianist left behind. Mostly classical pieces she'd learned years ago, pieces that still lived in her muscle memory despite all this time. The thought that began forming in her mind was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. She quickly pushed it away, focusing instead on finishing her closing duties. But as she counted her tips later that night, sitting on her bed in her tiny shared apartment, the image of that grand piano kept floating back into her thoughts. Her roommate was already asleep, the distant sound of city traffic creating a gentle backdrop to the quiet apartment. She pulled out her phone and found a recording of one of her favorite pieces, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. As the familiar notes filled her earbuds, her fingers moved silently through the air, muscle memory taking over. Despite years away from any piano, she could still feel every note, every dynamic change, every emotional surge in the music. Tomorrow would be just another busy shift, she told herself as she finally drifted off to sleep. But somewhere in her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, life was about to take another unexpected turn. The night of the charity gala arrived with a flurry of activity. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers as the waitress rushed between tables, her black apron filled with order tickets. The usual dinner crowd had been replaced by guests in elegant evening wear, their jewelry catching the light as they gestured with their champagne flutes. She couldn't help noticing the empty piano bench. Every few minutes, she'd catch Mr. Thompson glancing anxiously at his phone, then at the untouched instrument. The regular pianist's medical emergency had left them without entertainment for one of their most prestigious events of the year. Several guests had already asked about the music, expecting the usual sophisticated ambience the restaurant was known for. "Maybe we could just play some recorded classical music," she overheard the head server suggesting, But Mr. Thompson shook his head. These guests had paid hundreds of dollars per plate. They expected live entertainment. As she served the first course, she noticed a distinguished-looking gentleman at table 7 examining the piano with interest. She recognized him from magazine covers and concert posters. He was the conductor of the city's symphony orchestra. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down his plate of seared scallops, wondering what he might think if he knew she'd spent countless hours studying recordings of his performances. The wine was flowing freely now, the dining room filled with the warm buzz of conversation and laughter. She kept stealing glances at the piano between courses, her grandmother's words echoing in her head. Music isn't just in your fingers, it's in your heart. Her heart was certainly pounding now, as an idea she'd been pushing away all day refused to be silenced any longer. During a brief lull between the main course and dessert, she found herself walking toward Mr. Thompson's office. Her legs felt like they were moving on their own. She knocked softly on his door, her pulse racing. "Come in," he called, sounding distracted. She stepped inside, wiping her palms on her apron. "Sir, I could play the piano. For the guests." He looked up from his computer, surprise clear on his face. "You play?" "I used to. I studied for many years." The words tumbled out quickly. "I know most of the classical repertoire your regular pianist performs." Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism. "This isn't an open mic night at a coffee shop. These are some of our most important patrons." "I know." She took a deep breath. "Just give me one piece. If it's not what you want, I'll stop immediately." He studied her for a long moment, then glanced at his phone. Still no message from the regular pianist. "Finally," he sighed. "One piece. But if it's not up to our standards—" "It will be," she promised, her voice steadier than she felt. She slipped into the employee bathroom, splashing cold water on her face and smoothing her hair. In the mirror, her reflection looked both terrified and determined. She straightened her black uniform, wishing she had something more appropriate for performing. The walk to the piano felt like the longest of her life. A few guests noticed her approaching the instrument, their expressions curious. She sat down carefully on the bench, adjusting it to the right height. The keys gleamed before her, pristine and inviting. She took another deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne floated through the air, soft and tentative at first, then growing more confident. The familiar melody wrapped around her like an old friend, and suddenly she wasn't in an upscale Manhattan restaurant anymore. She was back in her grandmother's living room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, the music flowing from her heart through her fingers. The dining room had grown quieter, but she barely noticed. The piece built naturally, her dynamics rising and falling with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Every hour of practice, every competition, every moment she'd spent at a piano had prepared her for this. The final notes hung in the air like stars, and only then did she realize that the room had fallen completely silent. She opened her eyes, her hands still resting on the keys, afraid to look up at the reaction her impromptu performance had received. But then, from somewhere in the room, someone began to clap. The applause spread through the dining room like a wave, growing stronger with each passing second. The waitress sat frozen at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys, hardly daring to believe what was happening. When she finally gathered the courage to look up, she saw dozens of faces turned toward her, many of them standing, all of them wearing expressions of genuine amazement. Mr. Thompson stood near the kitchen door, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Two of her fellow servers had stopped mid-service to watch, their trays of desserts momentarily forgotten. But it was the distinguished conductor at table 7 who caught her attention. He was already making his way toward the piano, his eyes bright with interest. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of working with world-class musicians. "Where did you study?" She smoothed her apron nervously. I didn't actually. Not formally. My grandmother taught me until I was 14, and then she gestured vaguely at her waitress uniform, a simple explanation of how life had taken a different path. The conductor's eyebrows rose. No formal training. That's even more remarkable. Your interpretation of Chopin was, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Raw, perhaps, but incredibly honest. There's something very special in your playing. More guests were gathering around the piano now, their desserts forgotten. A woman in a midnight blue evening gown who served on the symphony's board of directors joined the conversation. Would you play something else for us? The waitress glanced uncertainly at Mr. Thompson, who now stood nearby. He nodded encouragingly. His earlier skepticism completely vanished. She turned back to the keys, took a deep breath, and began Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. This time, she was more aware of her audience, but instead of making her nervous, their presence seemed to fuel something inside her. The piece flowed from her fingers with a gentle melancholy that filled the room. She could feel the music touching something in her listeners, the way they leaned forward slightly, how their conversations died away, the soft sighs at particularly moving passages. This was what her grandmother had meant about music coming from the heart. When she finished, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. Phones had appeared in people's hands. Some were recording, others typing rapidly. The conductor was deep in conversation with the board member, both of them glancing her way occasionally. I have to ask, the conductor said, turning back to her. Would you be interested in some formal training? The conservatory has an adult education program, and with your natural talent. Her heart leaped, but reality quickly dampened her excitement. I work double shifts most days. And the cost. She tried to keep her voice steady, professional. A small commotion at one of the tables caught everyone's attention. An elderly gentleman, known for his generous arts patronage, was making his way over. He walked with a slight limp, leaning on an elegant cane, but his eyes were sharp and kind. My dear, he said, reaching the piano, music like that shouldn't be confined to serving shifts. Tell me, do you want to study? To really study? She thought of her tiny apartment, the long hours on her feet, the dreams she'd packed away years ago. More than anything, she whispered, surprising herself with her honesty. The gentleman nodded as if he expected this answer. Then we'll make it happen. He turned to the conductor. The foundation I chair has a fund for emerging talents. I think we've just found our next recipient. The room burst into excited chatter. Mr. Thompson was beaming now, probably already imagining the publicity. Her fellow servers were grinning and giving her thumbs up from across the room. But all she could think about was how much she wanted to call her grandmother, to tell her that those long-ago lessons in that farmhouse living room had finally led to something extraordinary. The conductor was already talking about auditions and schedules. The board member was exchanging contact information with the patron. And somewhere in the background, she could hear guests discussing the Waitress Virtuoso. But in that moment, sitting at a magnificent piano that had called to her for so long, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling that sometimes life's most beautiful melodies come when you least expect them. The morning after the gala, everything felt different yet exactly the same. The waitress still had to wake up at dawn, put on her uniform, and head to the restaurant for the breakfast shift. But now her phone was filled with messages from people she'd never met. Music teachers, local journalists, and even a few talent scouts who'd heard about the previous night's performance. Someone had posted a video of her playing Chopin. It wasn't professional quality, just shaky phone footage, but it had already gathered thousands of views. The comments section was a mix of praise and skepticism. Raw talent. Must be staged. Where had she been hiding? No way a waitress can play like that. Reading the comments during her break, she felt her stomach twist with anxiety. The conductor had arranged for her to meet with the conservatory's admission board next week. The elderly patron's foundation would cover her tuition, but the thought of playing for professional musicians made her hands shake so badly she could barely carry her serving tray. "Order up," called the kitchen chef, snapping her back to reality. She tucked her phone away and grabbed the plates of eggs Benedict. As she served breakfast to the morning regulars, she noticed how differently some of them looked at her now. The businessman who'd never glanced up from his newspaper actually smiled and asked about her music. During the quiet period between breakfast and lunch, she found herself drawn to the piano again. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams. She sat down, not to play. She didn't dare during regular service hours, but just to rest her fingers on the keys. "You should practice," Mr. Thompson said, appearing beside her. "We're not busy now, and you'll need to prepare for that audition." She stared at him in surprise. "Really? But what about the breakfast cleanup?" He shrugged. "Consider it part of your new job description, but you'll still need to work your regular shifts until the scholarship details are sorted out." The kitchen staff gathered near the service station as she began to play, this time choosing a piece she'd need for the audition. It wasn't as polished as the Chopin. Her fingers stumbled over some of the more difficult passages. 10 years of waiting tables had left her technical skills rusty. "That was horrible," she muttered after a particularly rough section. "Sounded pretty good to me," said one of the dishwashers, and the others nodded in agreement. They'd become her first practice audience, offering encouragement between loading dishes and prepping for lunch. That evening, after her double shift, she finally called her grandmother. The familiar voice brought tears to her eyes as she described everything that had happened. "But I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm too old to start now? What if everyone realizes I'm just a waitress pretending to be something else?" Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. "Remember when you were little and you were afraid to play in the church talent show? But you did it anyway, and afterward, you couldn't stop smiling for days. Sometimes being scared means you're doing exactly what you should be doing." The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Wake up, practice finger exercises on her worn electronic keyboard at home, work the morning shift, practice on the restaurant's piano during breaks, work the evening shift, go home and study music theory until her eyes burned. Her tip money went to buying secondhand music books, and her roommate complained of the constant sound of fingers tapping on the kitchen table as she practiced silent patterns while eating breakfast. The video of her performance had gone viral in classical music circles. Some comments were harsh, pointing out flaws in her technique, questioning her background. But others were supportive, celebrating the discovery of hidden talent in an unexpected place. A local news station wanted to interview her. Professional musicians began dropping by the restaurant, some offering advice, others simply curious to see the waitress pianist in person. A week before her audition, during a particularly busy dinner service, she dropped a full tray of water glasses. The crash brought the entire dining room to a standstill. As she knelt to clean up the mess, tears of exhaustion threatening to spill, she felt hands joining hers, her fellow servers, the busboy, even a regular customer, all helping to pick up the pieces. "We've got your back," whispered one of her coworkers. "Just don't forget us when you're famous." She laughed despite her tears, realizing that while her dreams of becoming a musician had been sleeping all these years, they'd never really died. They'd just been waiting, like a piano in the corner of a restaurant, for the right moment to make their melody heard. The week before her conservatory audition felt like the longest of her life. Dawn would find her at the restaurant's piano, practicing scales while the morning prep cooks chopped vegetables and heated ovens. Her fingers were getting stronger, but they still felt clumsy on the more challenging pieces. The conductor had recommended several compositions for her audition, each one more difficult than anything she'd played in her grandmother's living room. "Your technique needs work," he'd said during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the restaurant. "But don't lose that raw emotion in your playing. That's what makes you special." Special. The word didn't feel right when she was rushing between tables, balancing plates and remembering drink orders. But then there were moments, quiet ones, when she'd sit at the piano during her break, when the music would flow through her so naturally that she forgot about everything else. The kitchen staff had become her most loyal supporters. They'd created a makeshift practice schedule, coordinating their prep work around her playing. The head chef, usually gruff and demanding, would stick his head out of the kitchen to give a thumbs up after particularly good runs. Even the dishwashers had learned to time their clattering to her quieter passages. "Play that pretty one again," the pastry chef would request, meaning the Chopin nocturne that had started it all. It makes the desserts taste better when they're made with good music. Her hands were changing. Years of carrying heavy trays had made them strong, but now they were developing new kinds of strength. Her pinky fingers, weak from disuse, were slowly remembering how to dance across the keys. Her wrists, stiff from years of neglect, were becoming more flexible. Every night, she soaked them in warm water, massaging the tired muscles, preparing for another day of practice. The elderly patron kept his word about the scholarship, but she insisted on keeping some of her shifts at the restaurant. "I need to earn my way," she explained when he questioned this decision. "And besides, these people are my family now." Her small apartment had transformed into a musician's studio. Sheet music covered every surface, and she'd drawn a piano keyboard on paper, taping it to her kitchen table for silent practice during late-night study sessions. Her roommate had initially complained of the constant tapping, but now helped her study music theory during shared midnight snacks. One evening, just days before the audition, a group of regular customers requested that she play during their dinner. Mr. Thompson, seeing her hesitation, stepped in. "She's preparing for an important audition," he explained. But the customers persisted, and she found herself drawn to the piano, as always. This time was different, though. As she played, she could feel how much stronger her fingers had become, how much more confident her interpretations were. The music had a clarity that hadn't been there before, even if it wasn't yet perfect. When she finished, one elderly woman in the group had tears in her eyes. "My dear," the woman said, "I've been coming here for 20 years. I've heard dozens of professional pianists play that same piece on that same piano, but none of them made me feel it like you just did." Later that night, as she was closing up, her phone rang. It was her grandmother. "I've got a surprise for you," the familiar voice said. "I've bought a bus ticket. I'll be there for your audition." The news brought tears to her eyes. "But Grandma, it's such a long trip. Did I miss any of your childhood recitals? Even that terrible one when you were 7 and forgot the middle of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I'm not about to miss this one." That night, she stayed late at the restaurant, practicing until her fingers ached. The cleaning crew worked around her, humming along to the melodies they'd come to know over the past weeks. When she finally hit a particularly difficult passage perfectly, they all cheered, the sound echoing through the empty dining room. Walking home in the late-night city air, she felt different. The doubt was still there, the fear of failure still whispered in her ear, but something else was stronger now. Every callus on her fingers, every hour of practice, every encouraging word from the kitchen staff and customers, it was all building toward something. She wasn't just a waitress who played piano anymore. She was becoming who she was always meant to be. The morning of the audition arrived with a gentle spring rain. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night going over the pieces in her head. Her grandmother had arrived the evening before, immediately filling their tiny apartment with the smell of home-baked cookies and the warmth of unconditional support. "Eat something," her grandmother insisted, pushing a plate of toast across the kitchen table. But her stomach was too knotted to manage more than a few small bites. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her blouse. Not her waitress uniform today, but a simple white blouse she'd bought secondhand for the occasion. The conservatory building loomed before them, all stone and tall windows. Inside, the halls echoed with the sound of practice rooms, scales, arpeggios, fragments of classical pieces drifting through closed doors. Young students hurried past with instrument cases, their paths clear and certain. She felt every one of her 24 years, wondering if she'd look out of place among these lifetime musicians. "The walls aren't going to fall down if you walk through the door," her grandmother said gently, reading her hesitation. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The audition room was smaller than she'd expected, but the piano was magnificent, even finer than the one at the restaurant. The judges sat at a long table. The conductor who discovered her, two professors she didn't recognize, and an older woman whose stern expression made her heart sink. "Whenever you're ready," one of the professors said kindly. She sat at the piano, adjusting the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. What was she doing here? She was just a waitress who'd gotten lucky one night. She didn't belong in this room with these accomplished musicians. Then she remembered something the dishwasher had told her during one of her practice sessions. "When you play, it's like the music is telling a story. Don't think about the notes. Think about the story you want to tell." Her story, the years of childhood lessons in her grandmother's living room. The dreams set aside but never forgotten. The long hours on her feet, serving others while music waited quietly in her heart. The magical night when everything changed. The kitchen staff who'd become her cheerleaders, the customers who'd believed in her, the community that had formed around her journey. She began to play. The first piece was Bach, structured, technical, demanding absolute precision. She focused on making each note clear and purposeful, just as she'd practiced countless times during her breaks at the restaurant. Her fingers found their way through the complicated passages, muscle memory taking over where nerves might have failed. The second piece was Beethoven, full of drama and emotion. As she played, she could almost hear the chef's encouraging, "That's it." From the kitchen doorway, could almost see the regular customers nodding along. The music filled the room, her confidence growing with each measure. For her final piece, she'd chosen something unexpected, an original composition. It started simply, with the rhythmic sounds of a busy restaurant kitchen transformed into melody. Then it grew, layer by layer, like the growing complexity of her life these past months. The piece ended with a series of gentle, hopeful notes that reminded her of dawn breaking through the restaurant's windows. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. She kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to look up. Finally, the stern-faced woman spoke. "Your technique needs refinement," she said, and the waitress's heart sank. But then, "However, I haven't heard playing with that much honest emotion in a very long time. You understand something that many technically perfect pianists never grasped. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes, it's about telling a story." The conductor was beaming. One of the professors was wiping his eyes discreetly. Even the stern woman had softened slightly. "We'll need to discuss this," the kind professor said, "but I think it's safe to say you've given us a lot to think about." Outside the audition room, her grandmother waited with open arms. They held each other tightly, neither needing to speak. As they walked through the halls, a young student practicing Chopin drifted from one of the practice rooms, the same nocturne that had changed everything that night at the restaurant. Her phone buzzed with messages from the restaurant staff, eagerly awaiting news. Mr. Thompson had given everyone the evening off, promising a celebration regardless of the outcome. Looking at the texts, she realized that whatever the judges decided, she'd already gained something precious, a community that believed in her, a chance to pursue her dreams, and the courage to let her music tell her story. 1 year had passed since that rainy morning at the conservatory. The restaurant's grand piano gleamed in the evening light, just as it always had, but everything else had changed. Tonight was special, not just another dinner service, but her first official performance as part of the city's Emerging Artists program. The dining room had been transformed. Regular tables were pushed back to create a small concert space, and extra chairs lined the walls. Familiar faces filled every seat. Restaurant regulars who'd witnessed her journey from the beginning, her fellow students from the conservatory, and of course, the entire restaurant staff, dressed in their finest clothes instead of their usual uniforms. In the kitchen, the chef had prepared a special menu for the occasion, naming each dish after a classical composer. Bach's braised short ribs and Chopin's chocolate souffle had already sold out. The elderly patron who provided her scholarship sat at the front, beaming like a proud grandfather. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform anymore, but she'd kept one shift a week at the restaurant throughout her first year of studies. To stay grounded, she'd explain when people asked why. The truth was, she couldn't imagine leaving completely. These people had become her family. Her grandmother sat in the front row, next to her old electronic keyboard wrapped in bright paper. A graduation gift, she'd said earlier, explaining how she'd saved up to buy a new one. So you can practice properly at home now. As she walked to the piano, memories of that first impromptu performance flooded back. She was nervous, yes, but it was different now, more like excitement than fear. Her fingers were stronger, her technique more refined, but her teachers had helped her keep that raw emotion that made her playing special. Music tells stories, she'd learned to tell her own students. Young kids from the neighborhood who she taught on weekend mornings. And everyone has a story worth telling. The program began with Chopin's Nocturne, a tribute to where it all started. But this time, she played it with new understanding, each note shaped by a year of intense study and growth. The familiar melody filled the restaurant, and she could see some of the longtime customers closing their eyes, remembering that first magical night. Next came pieces she'd learned at the conservatory: Bach, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. Between each one, she shared short stories about her grandmother's living room lessons, about the kitchen staff who'd become her first audience, about the community that had formed around a waitress who dared to dream. For the final piece, she played her own composition, the one from her audition, but expanded and polished over the past year. It had grown with her, incorporating new elements of her life. The sound of practice rooms at dawn, the laughter of her young students, the continuing rhythms of restaurant life. As the last notes faded, she looked out at the faces before her. The stern woman from her audition jury was smiling now. The conductor who discovered her was nodding appreciatively. Her former coworkers were beaming with pride. But it was the new waitress, watching wide-eyed from the service station, who caught her attention. After the performance, as people mingled over champagne and dessert, the young waitress approached her shyly. "I've been taking piano lessons," she confided, "ever since I heard your story. I never thought it was possible to start so late, but—" "It's never too late to tell your story," she replied, remembering how many times she doubted herself a year ago. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the kitchen staff was finishing cleanup, she sat at the piano one last time. The restaurant was quiet except for the distant clinking of dishes and the soft hum of the cooling ovens. She played softly, not for an audience now, just for herself. Mr. Thompson appeared beside the piano, just as he had that first night. "You know," he said, "I still have the video from your first performance here. Over 1 million views now. People love a story about dreams coming true." She smiled, running her fingers lightly over the keys. "Dreams don't just come true," she said. "They're built, note by note, day by day, with help from more people than you'd ever expect." Through the windows, she could see the city lights twinkling like stars. Somewhere out there, other hidden talents were waiting to be discovered. Other stories were waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, her story would give someone else the courage to sit down at a piano, or pick up a paintbrush, or write that first page, to take that terrifying, wonderful first step toward becoming who they were meant to be.